The morning of November 1st, 1943, North Atlantic, 490 miles north of the Azores. Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins stood on the bridge of USS Borie, watching phosphorescent wakes knife through 15-foot swells. His radar operator had picked up a contact 8,000 yards out, another U-boat. The third his hunter-killer group had found in 24 hours. Hutchins was 27 years old, the youngest destroyer commander in the United States Navy. Just 5 days earlier, he'd successfully depth-charged U-256 until oil slicks bubbled to the surface. His crew, mostly reservists who'd never seen combat before joining Task Group 21.14, had finally tasted victory after months of tedious Atlantic patrols. They were hungry for more. But this contact was different. As Borie closed the distance at flank speed, lookouts spotted something that made Hutchins' blood run cold. The submarine was on the surface, running at full diesel power, and it wasn't diving. German U-boat commanders knew the rules by late 1943. When radar-equipped American destroyers found you at night, you crash-dived immediately. You didn't stay topside and invite destruction. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Unless you had no choice. Unless your submarine's dive planes were damaged, or your batteries were depleted, or your hull had been weakened by too many depth charge attacks. Hutchins realized he wasn't hunting a dangerous predator. He was approaching a cornered animal, and cornered animals fought back with everything they had. Borie accelerated to 34 knots, her bow cutting through the black water as gun crews scrambled to battle stations. At 400 yards, the destroyer's 4-inch guns opened fire, shells screaming across the gap in orange tracers. The U-boat returned. Fire immediately. Not with torpedoes, those took precious seconds to aim and launch, but with every automatic weapon on deck. 20mm rounds stitched across Borie's forward sections, punching through thin destroyer plating like it was paper. One burst hit the forward engine room, another raked the bridge, sending shrapnel spinning past Hutchins' head. His executive officer dove for cover. Hutchins stayed standing, watching the submarine's deck gun crew frantically traverse their 88mm cannon toward Borie's waterline. One solid hit from that weapon would punch through the destroyer's hull and flood entire compartments. The German gunners were seconds from firing. Hutchins had one option left. The oldest naval tactic in history, used by triremes in the Mediterranean 3,000 years before diesel engines existed. He ordered a hard right rudder and called for ramming speed. His helmsman hesitated. You could hear it in the fractional delay before the wheel spun. Ramming a U-boat wasn't doctrine. It wasn't in any manual. The Royal Navy had officially discouraged the practice 8 months earlier, after HMS Hesperus spent 3 months in dry dock, following her ramming of U-357. After HMS Harvester damaged her propellers ramming U-444, then got torpedoed and sunk by another submarine while limping away. Destroyers were lightly constructed compared to submarines. Their thin hulls were designed for speed, not for colliding with 800 tons of pressure-hardened steel moving through the water. But Hutchins wasn't thinking about doctrine or damage reports. He was thinking about that 88mm gun swinging toward his ship, and about the 20 German submariners frantically loading shells, and about the fact that in approximately 4 seconds they would open fire and quite possibly kill everyone on Borie's bridge. The destroyer surged forward. Borie's 20mm gunners had a perfect angle now, firing downward at the exposed U-boat deck from just 200 yards away. German sailors manning the anti-aircraft positions died at their guns, cut down by American fire before they could return more than a few bursts. The deck gun crew took direct hits. Bodies fell. Others dragged wounded men away from the weapon. A salvo of 3 4-inch shells from Borie's forward mount hit the U-boat's deck gun directly, blowing it off its mount before a single German round left the barrel. Then Borie's knife-edge bow struck U-405 amidships. The collision should have been catastrophic. 1,600 tons of destroyer hitting 800 tons of submarine at closing speeds of 40 knots combined. The mathematics of kinetic energy said Borie's thin plates should crumple, her forward compartments should flood, her keel should crack. But the Atlantic Ocean has never followed mathematics precisely. A rogue wave, one of the endless 15-footers rolling through the storm-tossed North Atlantic that night, hit at the exact moment of impact. The wave lifted Borie's bow, instead of striking the U-boat's hull at the waterline where physics said it should. The destroyer rode up and over, her bow coming down on top of the submarine's foredeck like a hammer. Metal shrieked. Rivets popped. Both vessels shuddered from the impact. When the wave passed, Borie was high-centered on top of U-405, stuck like a car balanced on a boulder, her propellers churning air 3 feet above the submarine's pressure hull. The two warships were locked together in a grotesque metal embrace. Hutchins' spotlight operator flipped on the 24-inch searchlight. White light flooded the scene, turning night into day and revealing a sight nobody on either crew had trained for. The destroyer and submarine were jammed together at a 30-degree angle, their hulls locked in a V-shape, close enough that sailors on both vessels could see each other's faces in the harsh illumination. Close enough to throw a baseball between ships, close enough that Borie's main guns, designed to engage targets at 10,000 yards, couldn't depress far enough to aim at the submarine 15 feet below. The 4-inch mounts tried. Gun crews spun their elevation wheels frantically. The barrels moved down, stopped. The shells would pass harmlessly over the submarine. Physics defeated them again. But the U-boat's weapons had no such limitation. Every automatic gun the Germans possessed could aim upward. The U-boat had 6 20mm cannons on rotating mounts, a quad mount behind the conning tower, single guns scattered along the deck. All of them could fire at the destroyer looming above, and several tried. A German sailor emerged from a hatch, saw the American destroyer balanced on top of his submarine, froze in shock for half a second, then sprinted for one of the machine gun mounts. Borie's crew shot him down before he reached it. Another German appeared. Bullets from American .30 caliber rifles punched him backward into the hatch. A third submarine crewman crawled toward the quad mount. A burst from one of Borie's 20s cut him apart. The battle devolved into something from a different century. Not modern naval combat with torpedoes and radar and calculated firing solutions. This was a musket range. This was close enough to see the enemy's eyes. Close enough that individual courage and individual marksmanship mattered more than technology. Borie's crew had trained for anti-submarine warfare, sonar contacts, depth charge patterns, hedgehog attacks. Nobody had trained them for a gunfight at 20 feet. The ship's armory carried exactly 14 rifles, 8 pistols, 6 shotguns, and 2 Thompson submachine guns. Standard destroyer armament for repelling boarders, a threat nobody in 1943 took seriously. Until now. Sailors grabbed whatever they could find. The rifles went first, distributed to the best marksmen. Then the pistols, the shotguns. When those ran out, men improvised. One sailor threw a 4-inch shell casing like a spear, 30 pounds of brass tumbling end over end across the gap. It struck a German sailor in the head and dropped him. Another American grabbed a sheath knife, waited for a target, and hurled it. The knife buried itself in a German submariner's shoulder. The executive officer had conducted a drill 5 days earlier, just a theoretical exercise. What would you do if a U-boat rammed us on the port side? The crew laughed. U-boats didn't ram destroyers. They torpedoed them from miles away. But the executive officer had insisted. Walk through the scenario. How would you fight? What weapons would you use? That drill saved lives. When Borie ended up locked to U-405, the crew didn't freeze. They acted. Men who'd never fired at a human target in their lives started shooting with grim efficiency. German sailors attempting to man deck weapons died before reaching them. Others, trying to launch torpedoes from the bow tubes, took rifle fire and fell back. The U-boat's skipper, Korvettenkapitan Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, was no novice. 37 years old, veteran of 7 war patrols, he understood the situation immediately. His submarine was disabled, his deck weapons couldn't function with a destroyer parked on top of him, and his crew was being slaughtered by American small arms fire. But he still had one advantage. The submarine was nimble. Even locked together, U-405 could maneuver. Borie, with her propellers spinning uselessly in air, could not. Hauptmann ordered his helmsman to turn. The submarine pivoted beneath the destroyer, twisting in the water, using her tighter turning radius to prevent Borie from bringing heavier weapons to bear. The two ships ground against each other, metal screaming, seams opening. Wave action and the submarine's maneuvering began working, Borie's hull plates apart. Water flooded into the forward engine room. Not catastrophically, not yet, but steadily. Cold Atlantic seawater, 3 degrees above freezing, pouring into spaces filled with hot machinery. Hutchins felt it. The subtle change in how his ship moved, the way she settled differently in the waves. Borie was taking damage. The submarine was too. But submarines were built to withstand depth charges. Destroyers were built for speed. In a grinding match, the U-boat would win. For 10 minutes, the two vessels remained locked together. 10 minutes of Americans shooting at Germans trying to reach weapons. 10 minutes of the submarine twisting, trying to position itself for a torpedo shot. 10 minutes of Borie's hull plates groaning under stress they were never designed to handle. Then another wave hit. Larger than the others, driven by wind gusting to 40 knots. The wave lifted both ships, twisted them, slammed them back down at a different angle. The metal-on-metal screech of hulls separating echoed across the water. Borie slid off the submarine and splashed back into the ocean proper, her propellers biting water again, her engines driving her forward. Hutchins immediately ordered hard rudder to come around for another attack. Hopman ordered the same. The two ships circled each other like boxers, each trying to gain advantage, neither able to break away. The destroyer had superior speed and firepower. The submarine had superior maneuverability and the desperation of men who knew they would die if they didn't fight. Hopman kept U-405 turning in tight circles. Borie's turning radius was 3 times larger. Every time the destroyer tried to line up a shot, the submarine had already pivoted, keeping its stern torpedo tube aimed at Borie's broadside. Hutchins watched that stern tube track his ship and made a calculation. He could maintain this stalemate, circling endlessly until fuel ran out. He could try to ram again, risking more damage to his already compromised hull, or he could do something counterintuitive. He cut the spotlight. Darkness crashed back over the scene. No more harsh white illumination. Just blackness and the faint glow of Borie's running lights. Hutchins was gambling that Hopman would make a mistake, that the German commander, suddenly blind, would attempt to escape rather than continue fighting. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Both ships maintained their circular courses, invisible to each other in the dark. Then U-405's diesels revved. The submarine was running. Hutchins flipped the spotlight back on. There was the U-boat, 500 yards out, trying to put distance between the combatants. Borie's engines pushed her to 27 knots. The destroyer closed rapidly, gun crews ready, depth charge crews standing by. At 200 yards, Hutchins ordered shallow set depth charges. 3 charges, set to detonate at 30 feet, rolled off Borie's stern and splashed into the water directly in the submarine's path. U-405 drove straight into the pattern. The charges exploded. Enormous columns of water erupted, lifting the submarine's stern clear of the surface for a moment before it crashed back down. The concussive force from underwater explosions does terrible things to submarine hulls. Welds crack, plates buckle. Internal equipment tears loose and crashes through compartments. Hopman's submarine slowed, then stopped. The engines were still running. The boat wasn't sinking. But it wasn't moving forward anymore. Borie's spotlight showed German sailors abandoning deck positions, diving through hatches, securing them from inside. 14 men appeared topside again moments later, wounded being loaded onto yellow rubber life rafts on stretchers. An officer, wearing a distinctive cap, stood on the conning tower for a moment, looked directly at the American destroyer, then descended through the hatch. It was the last anyone saw of Korvettenkapitän Rolf Heinrich Hopman. The submarine began settling. Stern first, bow rising. The classic death posture of a U-boat going down. Hutchins ordered cease fire. U-405 was finished. The German survivors in life rafts were waving white fabric, signalling surrender. Several appeared badly wounded. Borie moved closer to begin rescue operations. A star shell suddenly arced into the sky from one of the German rafts. Bright white light, the universal naval signal for location. Another star shell followed seconds later, fired from somewhere in the darkness. A different U-boat. Answering the call, Borie's lookout spotted a torpedo wake streaking toward the destroyer from the port side. Hutchins ordered an emergency turn. The torpedo passed close aboard, missing by yards. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The situation had reversed completely. Minutes ago, Borie was the hunter. Now she was prey, with at least one more U-boat in the area, with a damaged hull taking on water, with ammunition depleted from the gun battle, sitting next to rafts full of German survivors who'd just signaled their position to every submarine within 100 miles. Hutchins had no choice. He ordered maximum speed on a zigzag course away from the area. Borie's bow smashed through the German life rafts as she turned. Sailors on deck watched survivors disappear under the destroyer's wake. Nobody on the American ship enjoyed it, but staying meant getting torpedoed by the second U-boat, and Hutchins wasn't sacrificing his crew to rescue enemy sailors who'd just tried to kill them. The zigzagging continued for an hour. Borie's sonar pinged frantically, searching for the second submarine. Nothing. Either it had broken off, or it was running silent, waiting for an opportunity. The damage became apparent as adrenaline wore off. The forward engine room flooded to neck depth. Electrical systems failing. Fuel contaminated with seawater. Boiler water supply compromised. The collision with U-405 had cracked Borie's keel, opened seams along her port side, bent her bow 3 degrees to port. She was dying slowly. By dawn, the crew was dumping equipment overboard to keep the destroyer afloat. Ammunition, small arms, anything heavy that could be moved. The ocean was growing rougher. Swells that had been 15 feet during the battle were now 25 feet. 40-foot waves were forming on the horizon, the edge of a major Atlantic storm. Borie's sister ships from Task Group 21.14 arrived at first light. USS Borie and USS Goff took up positions alongside, attempting to pass towing lines in the mounting seas. The lines parted. Waves drove the destroyers apart before connections could be secured. Borie was rolling 45 degrees side to side, her broken keel flexing, more seams opening. At 14:30 hours on November 2nd, 26 hours after ramming U-405, the order came to abandon ship. The crew went over the side into rafts and were picked up by Borie and Goff. Hutchins was the last man off, staying aboard until every sailor was accounted for. Borie then put 4-inch shells into Borie's hull to scuttle her quickly before the approaching storm made rescue impossible. The destroyer that had rammed a U-boat and survived, that had fought in hand-to-hand naval combat like something from the age of sail, slipped beneath the Atlantic at 490 miles north of the Azores. Final casualties. USS Borie lost 27 crew members and 3 officers, most killed during the initial gun battle or during the ramming. USS Borie and USS Goff rescued 221 survivors. U-405 lost all 49 crew members. 24 died during the surface gun battle. The remaining 25 drowned when Borie ran through their life rafts or when U-405 sank. The Battle of the Atlantic had seen thousands of engagements between submarines and surface ships, torpedoes at long range, depth charges from above, hedgehog patterns, radar-guided attacks. But only a handful of times did destroyers and U-boats meet in close combat. And of those few encounters, USS Borie's ramming of U-405 stands as the most brutal, the most personal, and the most desperate. What makes the Borie incident remarkable wasn't just the ramming itself. It was that ramming worked when it shouldn't have. British experience said it was a losing proposition. HMS Hesperus, HMS Harvester, others that tried it, ended up more damaged than their targets. Yet American destroyer escorts between 1943 and 1945 successfully rammed U-boats multiple times. USS Buckley rammed U-66 in May 1944 and survived. USS Joyce, USS Peterson, and USS Gandhi rammed U-550 in April 1944. Multiple ships survived the tactic that British doctrine said would cripple them. Why? The answer lies not in better American construction or superior seamanship. It lies in the type of vessels attempting the rams. The British destroyers that got destroyed ramming U-boats were fleet destroyers. Large vessels, 1,400 to 1,600 tons, built for fleet actions and high-speed runs. Their hulls were optimized for hydrodynamics, which meant relatively thin plating in forward sections. When those thin plates hit submarine pressure hulls at ramming speed, the destroyers came apart. American destroyer escorts were different animals entirely. Smaller, 1,300 to 1,400 tons, but built explicitly for anti-submarine warfare. Their design prioritized durability over speed, thicker hull plating in bow sections, reinforced frames, construction that could handle the stress of repeated depth charge attacks, which involved rapid accelerations and decelerations that subjected hulls to tremendous strain. A destroyer escort was essentially a miniature cruiser, packed with weapons, designed to take punishment. When those reinforced bows hit U-boats, the submarines lost. Borie wasn't a destroyer escort. She was a 24-year-old Clemson-class fleet destroyer, the exact type that British experience said shouldn't attempt ramming, which makes her survival, even temporarily, even more remarkable. The collision physics that saved Borie involved factors nobody had calculated: the rogue wave that lifted her bow at impact, the angle of approach, 30 degrees off perpendicular rather than head-on, the fact that U-405 turned hard to port at the last instant, presenting her foredeck rather than her pressure hull. 3 variables, none planned, all combining to produce an outcome that defied expectations. Hutchins hadn't studied physics. He'd been a salesman in civilian life before the war, but he understood something fundamental about combat that transcended technical training. When conventional weapons won't work, you use unconventional ones. When your guns can't depress far enough, you use rifles. When torpedoes are too slow, you use your entire ship as a weapon. The psychological dimension of ramming proved as important as the physical. U-boat crews in late 1943 operated under crushing stress. Allied anti-submarine warfare had evolved from desperate improvisation in 1940 to systematic destruction by 1943. Improved radar meant submarines couldn't surface safely at night. Improved sonar meant submerged boats couldn't hide. Improved depth charges meant one solid attack could cripple a U-boat. German submariners called their vessels iron coffins. 75% of U-boat crews died during the war. 30,000 men out of 40,000 total who served. Those were suicide mission statistics, worse than any other service in any nation during World War II. When you're operating a weapons system with a 75% death rate, your tactical calculations change. You take risks because the alternative is certain death anyway. Hopman's decision to stay on the surface and fight Borie rather than crash dive made perfect sense in that context. His submarine was probably damaged already. Diving might flood compartments. Staying surfaced gave him a chance to fight with deck guns, maybe damage the destroyer enough to escape. It was a calculated gamble that almost worked. If that rogue wave hadn't lifted Borie's bow, if the collision had gone as physics predicted, Hopman might have torpedoed a crippled American destroyer and escaped into the darkness. Instead, both ships destroyed each other. Which raises the question: was ramming actually effective tactics, or just dramatic suicide? The statistics suggest it was effective, but only under specific circumstances. Of the dozen documented ramming attempts by Allied destroyers and destroyer escorts against U-boats between 1941 and 1945, 8 succeeded in sinking or severely damaging the submarine. 6 of those 8 successes were American vessels. The British attempts mostly failed because British destroyers were the wrong tool for the job. The American successes mostly worked because destroyer escorts were built tough enough to survive the collision. But success came at tremendous cost. Every American ship that rammed a U-boat required extensive repairs afterward. Borie sank outright. Buckley spent months in dry dock. Joyce needed structural reinforcement. Even successful ramming essentially traded a destroyer escort for a submarine, a roughly even exchange in tonnage but a losing trade in construction time and crew training, which meant ramming should have been a last resort tactic, used only when nothing else worked, and for most American destroyer escorts, it was. They relied on hedgehog mortars, depth charges, coordinated attacks with aircraft. Ramming happened when U-boats surfaced unexpectedly at close range, when there wasn't time for standard weapons, when the alternative was getting torpedoed. USS England, the most successful submarine hunter in U.S. Navy history, sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May 1944 without ramming any of them. She used hedgehog attacks, sonar tracking, methodical depth patterns. That was the proper way to hunt submarines. Systematic, low-risk, repeatable. Borie's ramming of U-405 represented the opposite approach. High-risk, improvised, unrepeatable. It worked once because of circumstances that would never align exactly that way again, but it revealed something about American naval culture in 1943 that explains how the United States won the Battle of the Atlantic. Junior officers were empowered to make independent decisions. Hutchins was 27 years old. 5 years earlier, he'd been selling insurance in civilian life. The Navy gave him command of a destroyer, trained him for 6 months, then sent him into the North Atlantic to hunt submarines. When doctrine didn't work, when the situation demanded creativity, nobody ordered him to check with higher authority. He made the call, rammed the submarine, accepted the consequences. British naval culture, constrained by centuries of tradition and formal procedure, struggled with that kind of decentralized initiative. British captains waited for orders, followed established doctrine. When doctrine failed, they requested new instructions. The delay between problem identification and solution implementation could take weeks. By the time new tactics filtered down from the Admiralty, the tactical situation had changed. American naval culture, born from necessity and lacking centuries of tradition to fight against, operated differently. Train the officers, give them equipment, trust them to solve problems independently. When Hutchins rammed U-405 without authorization, nobody court-martialed him. They gave him the Navy Cross. The message was clear. Initiative, even initiative that destroyed your own ship, was valued over blind adherence to doctrine. That cultural difference manifested across every aspect of anti-submarine warfare. British escort groups operated by the book. American hunter-killer groups experimented constantly. British submarines used established patrol patterns. American submarines ranged freely. British training emphasized procedure. American training emphasized problem-solving. Neither approach was inherently superior, but in the fluid, unpredictable environment of the Atlantic in 1943, the American approach adapted faster. When ramming proved effective under specific circumstances, American destroyer escort commanders started using it deliberately. Not often, not as first resort, but as a viable tactic when conditions warranted. The British never reached that conclusion because their institutional structure prevented the kind of rapid learning loop that American decentralization enabled. The ramming tactics' influence extended beyond World War II. Modern naval doctrine still includes ramming as a last-ditch option when other weapons fail, not because ramming is elegant or efficient, but because it represents the ultimate commitment. You're willing to destroy your own ship to destroy the enemy. That psychological impact matters. During the Cold War, Soviet submarine commanders knew American destroyers had successfully rammed U-boats. The knowledge affected Soviet tactics, making them more cautious about surfacing near American warships. Chinese submarine doctrine studied the same engagements. Modern training scenarios include close-quarters situations where ramming might be necessary. The principle remains relevant. When sophisticated weapons systems fail, the ship itself becomes a weapon. Borie's crew understood this instinctively during those 10 minutes locked to U-405. They weren't fighting with radars and torpedoes anymore. They were fighting with rifles and thrown objects, with courage and desperation, with the understanding that modern war could still devolve into something primitive and personal. The sailors throwing shell casings and knives at German submariners were doing what warriors had done for thousands of years, using whatever weapons came to hand, fighting at close quarters where individual skill mattered, accepting that sometimes survival required brutality. The German submariners responded the same way. Wounded men crawling toward deck guns, knowing they'd probably die before reaching them. Deck officers trying to launch torpedoes under rifle fire. The commander staying aboard until every crew member had escaped. U-boat service was voluntary. Nobody forced German sailors into submarines. They chose that duty, knowing the odds, knowing that most of them wouldn't survive the war, and they fought with the fatalistic courage of men who'd already accepted death. Hopman had survived 7 war patrols. He understood submarine warfare better than almost any German officer still alive in November 1943. Most of the experienced U-boat commanders were already dead by then, killed in the catastrophic losses of spring and summer 1943, when Allied anti-submarine warfare finally turned effective. That spring, May 1943 specifically, German submarines lost 43 boats in 1 month. 43 boats, each carrying 45 to 50 men, gone in 30 days. The losses were so severe that Admiral Karl Dönitz temporarily withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic entirely. For the first time since 1939, Allied convoys crossed without submarine attacks. By the time U-boats returned to the Atlantic in autumn 1943, the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. Centimetric radar made night surface attacks impossible. Improved sonar made submerged approaches deadly. Long-range patrol aircraft covered the mid-Atlantic gap where submarines used to refuel safely, and American hunter-killer groups, centered on escort carriers like USS Card, with destroyers like Borie screening them, actively hunted submarines rather than waiting for convoys to be attacked. U-405 was operating in that new environment, part of a 6-boat wolf pack called Siegfried I, searching for targets north of the Azores. But wolf-pack tactics, so effective in 1940 through 1942, didn't work anymore. Allied intelligence was reading German naval codes. High-frequency direction-finding equipment tracked U-boat radio transmissions. When submarines gathered into wolf packs and coordinated by radio, they gave away their positions. Task Group 21.14 had sailed specifically to intercept Siegfried I. Not by accident, by design. American codebreakers knew where the submarines would be. Borie's encounter with U-405 wasn't random, it was the result of intelligence directing hunters to prey. That intelligence advantage transformed the Battle of the Atlantic more than any single weapons system. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park decrypted German Enigma messages throughout the war. Americans developed high-speed bombs that could break 4-rotor Enigma faster than the Germans could change their codes. By late 1943, Allied commanders often knew German submarine positions better than German headquarters did. U-boat commanders thought they were operating in secure waters. They were actually sailing into ambushes. Hopman didn't know American destroyers were hunting his wolf pack specifically. He thought his encounter with Borie was bad luck. It was enemy intelligence reading his mail. The combination of intelligence, technology, and aggressive tactics made U-boat operations unsustainable by late 1943. German submarines were sinking fewer Allied ships per patrol while suffering catastrophic losses themselves. The tonnage war Dönitz had planned, sinking merchant ships faster than Allies could build them, had reversed. Allies were sinking U-boats faster than Germany could build them, and every lost submarine took 45 to 50 trained crew members with it, men who couldn't be replaced. German submarine training schools were conscripting teenagers by 1944, sending them to sea with minimal preparation because experienced instructors were dead. Compare that to American destroyer escort training. Recruits spent months learning anti-submarine warfare at dedicated schools. They practiced on captured U-boats. They studied actual combat reports. They trained with submarines playing enemy roles. By the time destroyer escort crews reached the Atlantic, they knew their equipment and tactics thoroughly. The crew quality difference showed in combat effectiveness. American destroyer escorts were sinking submarines at rates British escorts couldn't match. Not because American ships were better, but because American crews were better trained and American doctrine was more effective. Task Group 21.14, Borie's hunter-killer group, sank 4 submarines during their October 1943 patrol before encountering U-405, 4 confirmed kills in 1 month. That success rate was typical for American hunter-killer groups in late 1943. British escort groups, defending convoys rather than hunting aggressively, might get one kill every 3 months. The organizational difference was philosophical. British escorts protected merchant ships. American hunter-killer groups destroyed submarines. Both approaches worked, but the American method was offensive rather than defensive. It put psychological pressure on U-boat commanders, forcing them to worry about being hunted rather than focusing on attacking convoys. That psychological pressure contributed to German mistakes. U-boats stayed submerged longer, draining batteries. They avoided surfacing to recharge, reducing operational range. They broke radio silence unnecessarily, giving away positions. The cumulative effect of these stress-induced errors made U-boats easier to find and kill. By the time Borie rammed U-405, German submarine effectiveness had declined 70% from 1942 levels. Fewer successful attacks, lower survival rates, declining morale. The men volunteering for U-boat duty in late 1943 knew they were signing death sentences. They went anyway, motivated by propaganda, national loyalty, or the grim fatalism of military service in a losing war. The Battle of the Atlantic reached its turning point in May 1943, 6 months before Borie's ramming attack, but individual engagements like the Borie U-405 duel continued demonstrating how the tactical balance had shifted. American warships could now afford to take risks, like ramming submarines, that would have been suicidal earlier in the war. The industrial capacity that built 500 destroyer escorts between 1943 and 1945 meant losing one ship didn't significantly impact Allied capabilities. Germany built 1,262 U-boats during the entire war. The United States built anti-submarine vessels almost as fast as Germany built submarines. That production advantage translated into tactical flexibility. American commanders could accept higher losses on individual ships because replacements were already under construction. Hutchins understood this, consciously or unconsciously, when he ordered the ram. Losing Borie might be acceptable if it meant killing a U-boat. The calculation proved correct. Task Group 21.14 received a Presidential Unit citation for their 1943 patrols. The citation specifically mentioned their aggressive tactics and willingness to take risks. Borie's sacrifice contributed to that success, demonstrating that American destroyer crews would do whatever necessary to destroy submarines, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. That demonstration of commitment affected German morale more than the physical loss of one submarine. U-boat commanders hearing about Borie's ramming attack understood they faced enemies who wouldn't quit, who'd use their ships as weapons when conventional armaments failed, who valued submarine kills more than their own survival. That's a terrifying opponent to face. The ramming tactic's psychological impact extended to American crews as well. Sailors who knew their commanders would ram if necessary fought with greater confidence. They weren't abandoning ship at the first torpedo hit. They weren't running from surface gun duels. They were closing to point-blank range and engaging in brutal close-quarters combat because their culture valued aggressive action over cautious survival. That cultural difference, more than technology or numbers, explains American success in the Atlantic. British crews were brave, German crews were brave, but American crews combined bravery with an institutional permission to improvise, experiment, and take risks that other navies' rigid hierarchies prevented. When Borie's crew threw shell casings and knives at German submariners, they weren't following any doctrine. They were improvising based on immediate tactical necessity. When Hutchins rammed U-405, he wasn't executing a planned maneuver. He was adapting to circumstances that nobody had anticipated. That adaptability, multiplied across hundreds of destroyer escorts and thousands of engagements, created an anti-submarine campaign so effective that Germany surrendered partially because their submarine force had been destroyed. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, only 30 U-boats remained operational from a force that had peaked at over 400 boats at sea. 785 U-boats had been sunk. The mathematics of attrition that Dönitz thought would starve Britain into submission had reversed, destroying the submarine force instead. The Battle of the Atlantic consumed more resources, time, and lives than any other continuous military campaign in World War II. From September 1939, when German U-boats began hunting Allied merchant ships, to May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the struggle never paused. Over 5.5 years of continuous combat, 72,000 Allied merchant seamen died, many drowning in oil-slicked water after their ships were torpedoed, watching rescue vessels sail past because stopping meant becoming the next target. 3,500 Allied merchant ships sank, carrying millions of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and equipment to the ocean floor. 175 Allied warships went down fighting submarines. The human cost was staggering, but the strategic stakes were higher. Britain imported half its food and most of its fuel from overseas. If the U-boats could cut those supply lines, Britain would starve. The Soviet Union depended on Allied convoys delivering tanks, aircraft, and supplies through Arctic waters. If those convoys stopped, the Eastern Front might collapse. The American military buildup in Britain for the eventual invasion of France required moving millions of tons of equipment across the Atlantic. If U-boats prevented that buildup, D-Day would be impossible. Winston Churchill, rarely given to exaggeration, later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Not the Luftwaffe bombing London, not Rommel's Afrika Korps threatening Egypt, not Japanese forces conquering Southeast Asia. The submarines were the existential threat. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood this perfectly. His strategy was mathematically simple. Sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, every month, sustained over time. Do that consistently, and Britain's reserves would drain faster than convoys could replenish them. By mid-1942, Dönitz was winning that tonnage war. His U-boats were sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. In November 1942 alone, U-boats sank 119 Allied merchant ships, totaling over 700,000 tons. The target was met. If that rate continued for 6 more months, Britain would face critical shortages of food and fuel. Rationing would intensify. Industrial production would slow. The political will to continue fighting might crack, but the rate didn't continue. Something fundamental shifted in early 1943. New technologies came online, new tactics proved effective, new weapons turned the hunters into the hunted, and American industrial capacity, which had been ramping up since 1941, finally hit its stride. The destroyer escort program exemplified that industrial response. Before the United States entered the war, the Navy had 70 destroyers available for Atlantic convoy duty. Not enough to adequately protect convoys while also hunting submarines aggressively. Britain had destroyers, but needed them for Mediterranean operations, Pacific operations, and fleet actions against German surface ships. There simply weren't enough anti-submarine vessels to do everything required. American shipyards solved that problem through mass production. The destroyer escort design was deliberately simple, smaller than fleet destroyers, slower, less heavily armed, but specifically optimized for submarine hunting. They displaced 1,400 tons compared to 2,100 tons for fleet destroyers. They made 24 knots compared to 35 knots for fleet destroyers. They carried 3 3-inch guns compared to 5 5-inch guns for fleet destroyers. But they had excellent sonar, ample depth charge capacity, and the new Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar that could attack submarines without losing sonar contact. Most importantly, they could be built fast and cheap. American yards delivered over 500 destroyer escorts between 1943 and 1945. 500 ships, each crewed by 200 men, each specifically designed to kill submarines. That's 100,000 trained submariners hunters added to the Atlantic in 2 years. Germany built 1,262 U-boats during the entire war, 6 years of production. The United States built anti-submarine vessels at roughly the same rate as Germany built submarines, but American vessels had longer operational lifetimes, better maintenance, and crews that could be rotated to prevent exhaustion. German U-boat crews went on patrol until they died, or their submarine became too damaged to continue. American destroyer escort crews did 2 Atlantic crossings, then got 2 weeks in port for rest and maintenance. That rotation policy alone improved American effectiveness dramatically. Fresh crews made fewer mistakes. Well-maintained ships had higher equipment reliability. Compare that to German submarine operations in late 1943. U-boats stayed at sea for months, far beyond recommended operational limits, because Donitz needed every submarine on patrol to maintain attack pressure. Crews operated while exhausted. Equipment broke down and couldn't be properly repaired at sea. The cumulative effect of fatigue and poor maintenance showed in declining German effectiveness. U-boats were making more mistakes, taking longer to execute attacks, failing to maintain proper security procedures. Allied intelligence noticed the decline and exploited it ruthlessly. The intelligence advantage the Allies developed remains one of the war's most significant secret victories. German submariners never knew their communications were being read in near real time. They transmitted position reports, weather observations, attack results, and received orders via radio, believing their Enigma encryption was unbreakable. It wasn't. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had cracked Enigma in 1940, though with considerable difficulty. When Germany introduced four-rotor Enigma machines for submarine communications in February 1942, there was a 10-month blackout where U-boat messages couldn't be read. During those 10 months, German submarines inflicted devastating losses on Allied convoys. The Americans, working with British intelligence, developed high-speed bombs that could break four-rotor Enigma in hours rather than weeks. By December 1942, U-boat messages were being decrypted again. By mid-1943, the process was so efficient that Allied convoy routing officers often knew U-boat positions faster than German headquarters did. Convoys could be routed around wolf-pack concentrations. Hunter-killer groups could be directed to intercept submarines. The intelligence loop that let Task Group 21.14 find and destroy 5 U-boats in 1 month wasn't luck or superior technology. It was knowing exactly where enemy submarines were operating and sending forces to kill them. German submariners thought they were facing random encounters with enemy escorts. They were actually sailing into planned ambushes. That intelligence advantage combined with technological improvements to create a systematic submarine killing machine. Centimetric radar, operating at 10 centimeters wavelength instead of the older 1.5 meter systems, could detect submarine conning towers at ranges up to 9 miles in good conditions. The shorter wavelength was harder for German radar detectors to pick up, meaning U-boats often didn't know they'd been detected until destroyer escorts were already closing for attack. Improved sonar, particularly American QHB equipment, could track submarines at greater ranges and maintain contact even when the submarine maneuvered radically. Hedgehog mortars let destroyer escorts attack without losing sonar contact, unlike depth charges which forced ships to pass over the target and lose tracking. But the most important technological advantage wasn't a weapon. It was the escort carrier. These small aircraft carriers, built on merchant ship hulls, displaced around 10,000 tons and carried 20 to 30 aircraft. Slow, with maximum speeds around 19 knots, they could keep pace with convoys while providing organic air cover throughout the voyage. Before escort carriers, the mid-Atlantic air gap was a dead zone where submarines could surface safely to recharge batteries and attack convoys without fear of aircraft. After escort carriers, there was no safe zone. American yards built over 120 escort carriers during the war. By late 1943, hunter-killer groups built around escort carriers were roaming the Atlantic, actively searching for submarines. Task Group 21.14, Borie's group, was built around escort carrier USS Card. A Bogue-class escort carrier, Card displaced 11,000 tons and carried 9 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. The Avengers carried depth charges and could attack submarines spotted on the surface. The Wildcats provided air cover and could strafe submarines, forcing them to dive. Together, they extended the group's detection radius by hundreds of miles. Card's aircraft found U-boats. The destroyer escorts, Borie and her sisters, killed them. The combination proved devastatingly effective. Task Group 21.14 was credited with sinking 9 U-boats during their 1943 operations, making them one of the most successful hunter-killer groups in the Atlantic. Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, understood what these groups represented. Not just tactical effectiveness, but a fundamental shift in naval warfare philosophy. For centuries, capital ships, the battleships and cruisers, had dominated naval strategy. Destroyers were auxiliary vessels, screening the battle line, conducting torpedo attacks, protecting against submarine threats. The escort carrier groups inverted that hierarchy. The carrier became the capital ship. The destroyer escorts became the primary striking force. Battleships were relegated to shore bombardment and anti-aircraft platforms. This organizational innovation, born from desperate necessity in the Atlantic, would define naval warfare for the next 80 years. When Hutchins rammed U-405, he was operating within this evolved system. His destroyer was part of a hunter-killer group that had already sunk 4 U-boats that patrol, using coordinated aircraft and surface ship attacks. The ramming attack was an aberration, a throwback to earlier combat methods, but it occurred within a context of modern systematic submarine hunting. The Battle of the Atlantic by late 1943 wasn't individual ships dueling anymore. It was an industrial-scale campaign where intelligence directed forces to targets, technology detected and tracked targets, and coordinated attacks destroyed targets with assembly line efficiency. Borie's dramatic close-quarters fight with U-405 was the exception that proved the rule. Most U-boats died without ever seeing their killers, depth-charged from above by aircraft they never detected, or hedgehog-mortared by destroyer escorts whose sonar tracked them from beyond visual range. German submarine commanders knew this. Post-war interviews with surviving U-boat officers reveal consistent patterns. They described increasing fear of surfacing, knowing that American radar could detect them at night. They described the terror of hearing destroyer propellers approaching at high speed, knowing depth charges would follow. They described the hopelessness of trying to evade when sonar had already locked onto them. One U-boat commander, interviewed in 1946 while in Allied custody, said the psychological pressure was worse than the actual attacks. You knew they could find you any time. You knew you probably wouldn't survive the patrol. You went anyway because orders and duty demanded it. But you also knew it was suicide. That psychological dimension of submarine warfare affected German effectiveness as much as Allied technology did. Stressed, exhausted, demoralized crews made mistakes. They dove too slowly when aircraft appeared. They stayed submerged too long, draining batteries. They surfaced in the wrong locations. They transmitted radio messages they should have kept silent about. Each mistake created an opportunity for Allied forces to exploit, and Allied forces were ruthlessly efficient at exploitation. When a U-boat transmitted a position report, high-frequency direction-finding equipment triangulated its location within minutes. That information went to convoy routing officers, who directed hunter-killer groups to intercept. The U-boat commander thought he was safely reporting his position to headquarters. He was actually painting a target on himself. The cumulative effect of these advantages — intelligence, technology, tactics, industrial capacity, and crew quality — turned the Battle of the Atlantic decisively in Allied favor by mid-1943. The losses that shocked German Naval Command in May 1943, 43 U-boats sunk in 1 month, weren't an anomaly. They were the new normal. June saw 17 U-boats sunk, July saw 37, August saw 25. The monthly losses stayed above 20 through the end of the war, with occasional spikes into the 30s and 40s. Germany couldn't sustain those loss rates. U-boat construction peaked at 30 boats per month in 1943. Losses averaged 25 per month during the same period. The submarine force was slowly bleeding to death, losing boats faster than replacements arrived. And unlike ships, trained crews couldn't be quickly replaced. A competent U-boat commander needed 2 years of training minimum. Sonar operators, torpedo men, diesel mechanics, navigators all required specialized skills developed over months of instruction. When a submarine sank, it took 45 to 50 trained specialists with it, men who represented years of collective training investment. German submarine schools tried to accelerate training, pushing recruits through compressed courses, but rushed training produced crews that made more mistakes and died faster. By 1944, the average U-boat crew had less than 6 months training before their first patrol. Compare that to 1941, when crews trained for 18 months. The quality decline was evident in operational effectiveness. American destroyer escort crews, by contrast, were better trained in 1944 than in 1942. Training programs had been refined based on combat experience. Instructors were veterans who'd actually hunted submarines. Equipment in training facilities matched what crews would use operationally. The result was crews that arrived in the Atlantic combat-ready, with realistic expectations and proven tactics. Borie's crew exemplified this. Lieutenant Commander Hutchins was young and inexperienced in absolute terms, but he'd completed rigorous training and learned from experienced officers. His executive officer had the foresight to conduct ramming drills 5 days before the actual ramming occurred. That kind of proactive preparation, thinking through unlikely scenarios before they happened, separated professional military organizations from improvised ones. The ramming drill that saved lives during Borie's engagement with U-405 demonstrates something important about military training. You can't predict every combat scenario, but you can develop thinking patterns that let crews adapt when unexpected situations arise. The executive officer who ran that drill wasn't prescient. He was following best practices, wargaming unusual scenarios, preparing the crew mentally for situations outside normal parameters. When the unlikely scenario actually occurred, the crew didn't freeze because they'd already thought through the problem and developed potential solutions. That kind of mental preparation, multiplied across hundreds of ships and thousands of crew members, created a force capable of adapting faster than enemies could evolve countermeasures. German U-boat doctrine, by contrast, became increasingly rigid as the war progressed. Dönitz issued detailed patrol instructions. U-boat commanders were expected to follow orders precisely, report constantly, and coordinate with other submarines per predetermined plans. That centralized control made sense when German submarines dominated the Atlantic. It became a liability when Allies could read German communications and predict U-boat movements. The Wolfpack tactics that worked brilliantly in 1941 failed catastrophically in 1943 because radio coordination gave away Wolfpack positions. German submarines gathered exactly where Allied intelligence predicted they would, sailed exactly where convoy routing officers expected, and got systematically destroyed by hunter-killer groups sent specifically to kill them. Some German submarine commanders recognized the problem and began operating independently, ignoring orders, maintaining radio silence, hunting individually rather than in coordinated groups. Those commanders had higher survival rates and occasionally inflicted significant damage, but the German naval hierarchy punished independent action. Commanders who deviated from orders faced courts-martial. The institutional culture valued obedience over effectiveness, which meant innovative commanders who might have adapted tactics successfully were instead suppressed. That cultural rigidity, combined with strategic incompetence at the highest levels, doomed the U-boat campaign more effectively than Allied technology did. Hitler's interference in naval strategy made things worse. He demanded U-boats remain in certain areas for political rather than military reasons. He diverted submarines to Mediterranean operations where they had minimal impact instead of concentrating them in the Atlantic where they might have achieved strategic effects. He ordered the construction of advanced Type XXI submarines, revolutionary designs that might have restored German submarine superiority, but refused to prioritize their production over other weapon systems. By the time Type XXI boats began operational trials in 1945, Germany had already lost the war. The submarines that might have made a difference in 1943 arrived 2 years too late to matter. American leadership made mistakes too, but the decentralized command structure meant mistakes didn't cascade into systematic failure. When destroyer escort tactics proved ineffective, local commanders modified them without waiting for approval from Washington. When hunter-killer group coordination needed improvement, task group commanders experimented with different approaches and shared successful innovations. The institutional culture rewarded initiative and tolerated failure as long as lessons were learned. That flexibility let the American anti-submarine campaign evolve continuously adapting to German countermeasures faster than German doctrine could counter-adapt. Borie's ramming of U-405 fit perfectly into that culture. Hutchins made an independent tactical decision without authorization. He destroyed an enemy submarine at the cost of his own ship. Instead of being court-martialed for losing his vessel, he received the Navy Cross for sinking the submarine. The Navy's response sent a clear message. Aggressive action that destroyed enemies was valued even when it involved accepting heavy losses on your own side. That message propagated through the destroyer escort force, encouraging commanders to take risks, to close with enemy submarines, to fight at ranges where both sides could inflict damage rather than trying to stay safely distant. The result was an anti-submarine campaign prosecuted with unusual ferocity. American destroyer escorts didn't just drive submarines away from convoys. They pursued submarines for hours or days until they achieved kills. They coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. They used aircraft, surface ships, and intelligence in combined operations. They experimented with new weapons like acoustic homing torpedoes that could track submarines autonomously. And when conventional weapons failed, when circumstances demanded it, they rammed submarines with their own hulls. That willingness to commit absolutely to submarine destruction, to accept trading ships one for one if necessary, demonstrated a strategic commitment that affected German morale as much as it affected German submarine numbers. U-boat commanders in late 1943 understood they faced an enemy that wouldn't quit, an enemy with superior technology, superior numbers, superior intelligence, and superior institutional culture. The psychological impact of that realization was crushing. You can fight superior technology. You can fight superior numbers. But when the enemy has every advantage and refuses to give up, when they'll ram you with their own ships if necessary to kill you, what hope remains? German submarine morale collapsed during late 1943. Patrol lengths decreased as commanders found excuses to return to port early. Attack aggressiveness declined as submarines avoided engagements where they might take damage. Surrender rates increased among submarines that surfaced after depth charge attacks. The Battle of the Atlantic ended not with a dramatic final confrontation, but with exhaustion and attrition. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, only 30 operational U-boats remained from a force that had peaked at over 400 boats. Most had been sunk. Many others were too damaged for further operations. Crews that remained were untrained teenagers rushed through abbreviated courses. The infrastructure that supported submarine operations, shipyards, supply depots, training facilities, had been bombed into rubble. Even if Germany had possessed working submarines, it lacked the capability to maintain them or the trained crews to operate them effectively. Allied victory in the Atlantic made D-Day possible. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 required moving over 2 million men, plus millions of tons of equipment and supplies, across the English Channel. That concentration of forces in Britain over 18 months was only possible because Atlantic convoys delivered those men and materials safely. If U-boats had maintained their 1942 effectiveness levels, that build-up would have been impossible. Britain would have struggled just to feed its population, much less host the largest amphibious invasion in history. The thousands of merchant seamen who died in the Atlantic, the hundreds of destroyer escorts and destroyer crews who fought submarines for years, and the individual dramatic actions like Borie's ramming of U-405, all contributed to creating the conditions that let Allied armies invade France and ultimately defeat Germany. The ramming tactic itself never became standard procedure. It remained a last resort, used when other weapons couldn't engage, when circumstances demanded immediate action, when trading damage for kills was acceptable. But its existence in the tactical playbook demonstrated the commitment level American forces brought to the anti-submarine campaign. Modern naval forces still train for ramming scenarios, though with the understanding that it's something you do when every other option has been exhausted. The psychological principle remains relevant. Enemies who know you'll destroy your own ship to destroy theirs fight, differently than enemies who think you'll run when damaged. Borie's final moments exemplify both the dramatic and the tragic elements of the Battle of the Atlantic. The crew abandoned ship in 40-foot seas, bobbing in life rafts, while sister destroyers attempted rescue operations in deteriorating weather. 27 sailors and 3 officers didn't survive to reach the rescue ships. They'd survived the gun battle with U-405, only to die in the storm-tossed Atlantic, waiting for rescue. War's mathematics are often cruelly arbitrary. You can do everything right, fight bravely, destroy the enemy, and still die from weather or bad luck or simple timing. The Battle of the Atlantic killed indiscriminately. Merchant seamen who never fired a weapon. Submarine crews who followed orders precisely. Destroyer crews who fought with courage and skill. The ocean didn't distinguish between heroes and victims. It killed them all with equal efficiency. But the mission succeeded. U-405 never torpedoed another Allied merchant ship. The 49 German submariners aboard never threatened another convoy. Task Group 21.14's patrol successfully reduced German submarine strength in the North Atlantic by 5 boats, a significant contribution to the larger campaign, and the example of American destroyer crews willing to ram submarines, to fight at knife range with small arms, to improvise weapons from whatever came to hand, sent a message to every other U-boat commander operating in the Atlantic. These enemies won't run, won't quit, won't give you any quarter. That psychological impact, impossible to quantify but real nonetheless, contributed to the cumulative pressure that broke German submarine morale. The Battle of the Atlantic's legacy extends far beyond World War II. Modern anti-submarine warfare doctrine descends directly from tactics developed between 1939 and 1945. Sonar technology, though vastly improved, operates on principles established during that campaign. Coordinated attacks combining aircraft and surface ships remain the standard approach. Intelligence-driven targeting, using signals intelligence and other sources to locate submarines before attacking them, reflects the methods that proved successful in the Atlantic. Even the organizational structure of modern carrier battle groups, with destroyers screening a central carrier while aircraft extend detection ranges, derives from escort carrier hunter-killer groups like Task Group 21.14. The industrial dimension of the Atlantic campaign established precedents that shaped Cold War military planning. The United States' ability to outproduce enemies, building ships and aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, became a cornerstone of American defense strategy. When Soviet submarines threatened NATO convoys during the Cold War, American response plans assumed massive destroyer escort production could overwhelm Soviet submarine numbers through sheer industrial capacity. That assumption, drawn directly from World War II experience, influenced procurement decisions and force structure planning for 50 years. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.